the Far East and the European nations use far more oil than we do?
No, they use far more Middle Eastern oil.
That's what I mean.
Yes, I think so.
Why is that?
Well, because they haven't the Western Hemisphere sources of oil.
So go back to the oil again. 1930s or so, oil is founded out there, and
then it develops very rapidly. And, of course, it suddenly transforms these rather simple pastoral economies with an injection of immense wealth. It has a very disruptive effect. And on the whole, I should say that oil has been a curse to the Arab world.
Why?
Precisely this reason. There's this old American dictum, no taxation without representation. And what is sometimes overlooked is that the converse is also true. No representation without taxation. With oil revenues, they didn't need taxes, and therefore they didn't need assemblies to levy taxes. And they were made independent of public opinion in their own countries with this untold wealth accruing from oil revenues. This greatly strengthened the power of autocratic governments, far greater than it had ever been in the past. Now, traditional Islamic government is authoritarian, but it is not dictatorial or despotic. It is government under certain rules and so on. In modern times, the power of the ruler has been vastly augmented by these huge revenues, so that he doesn't need public support and public approval of his taxes. It has also been increased by all kinds of modern devices for surveillance and repression, so that any tin-pot dictator today wields far greater powers than were ever wielded by Suleiman the Magnificent or Harun al-Rashid or any of the legendary rulers of the Islamic past.
Are they ever going to run out of oil?
Either they'll run out of it, or it will be superseded by some other source of energy.
You imply that we'll get out of it some way through technology?
I hope so.
Do you see any evidence of that?
Well, there are various projects that I hear of for deriving energy from wind and water and the sea waves and so on, but these are technical questions on which I wouldn't be competent to.
Do you have any sense why we haven't moved to the alternative in any strong way, to an alternative fuel source for automobiles and trucks?
Well, look, oil is so easy and so entrenched.
Are you surprised, though, in a time like this when we're being threatened and with the terrorists, that we don't begin talking about?
I am surprised at that, yes. I would have thought that this is a good moment for trying to develop other sources of energy which would make us less dependent on this dangerous and unstable region. I think also that while the oil has been a nuisance to us, I think it has been a curse to them.
Why?
For the reason I mentioned before, it has strengthened, in many ways reinforced, autocratic government. It has made government more oppressive and more effectively oppressive than it had been in the past. It has inhibited the development of other forms of gainful economic effort. I mean, by all the normal indicators, the economic performance record of the Middle East is abysmal. Whether you look at GNP, GDP, per capita figures, job creation, and so on, they come really low on the international lists. And one of the reasons for that is oil money, which made it unnecessary to seek gainful employment, to develop industries, to develop other forms of activity.
Let me go back to your life just for a moment. You came here in 1974.
74, yes.
Why did you make the move?
Well, Princeton made me an offer I couldn't refuse. The New Jersey expression, which I have learned.
But you'd been at the University of London for years.
Oh, yes, and I had been to this country many times as a visitor. First time I set foot in the United States was in 1954, when I came on a lecture tour around the country. Then the following year I went to UCLA as a visiting professor. And after that, a number of short appointments, including 2 in Princeton, 1 at the university, and 1 at the Institute for Advanced Study. And then in 74, I moved over entirely.
Now, did you notice the difference in your students between the University of London and Princeton?
Yes, of course. You bring me onto delicate ground. Let me generalize it, not refer to those two specific universities, but to the university education generally in both countries, because I have some idea of other universities besides the two with which I was particularly connected. I would say, putting it briefly and therefore with some measure of oversimplification, that undergraduate education is better in England and graduate education is better here. So that students who do a first degree here and a higher degree in England manage to get the worst of both worlds. Quite a number do that.
So when you came to teach, how about interest in the Middle East? Did you find more interest in Britain or here?
Oh, a little more there, but I don't think it was a big difference. It rather depended on the news. I mean, at Princeton, for example, and I suppose the same is true in other universities, in 1991 there was an upsurge in enrollment for Middle Eastern courses, which then died away again. There's an upsurge now, of course.
Are you still teaching it?
No, I'm emeritus.
How long have you been emeritus?
Since '86.
Are you surprised at 85 years old you're working as hard as you are, people want to talk to you?
I'm more than surprised, I'm astonished.
And then you've had a lot of people in this town want to talk to you.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of how dramatic that is?
Well, not only do they want to talk to me, but what's even more remarkable, they want to listen to me.
What kind of people?
Oh, well, I really shouldn't discuss that.
But give us, I mean, without naming, if you don't want to name them, I mean, have you been to the White House?
People in various branches of government, let me put it that way.
Have you missed talking to many people on both sides of the political fence?
If by political front you mean Republicans or Democrats, government or opposition, yes, I've been talking to people on both sides.
What do they want to know from you?
Mostly what you want to know.
Do you sense that they know anything about that part of the world?
Oh, some of them do. There are people that are very well informed about the Middle East.
But do you go away
There are others that are remarkably ill-informed.
I just wonder if you ever go away from these conversations saying, we got problems here. These folks don't know anything.
No, I haven't been to those departments.
We first are asking about oil and then about Israel.
Yes.
What role has Israel played in all this?
Well, if you look at the published statements, you would think that the Israel-Palestine question is of primary importance. Certainly it is important. But I don't think it's of primary importance. It is given importance because it is the only grievance that can be freely and safely expressed in Arab countries. Other grievances against the policies and behavior of their rulers cannot be expressed. And that and also anti-Americanism, anti-Israel, anti-American, these are the two safety valves for letting it out. Now, why do I think that's exaggerated? Because if you look at bin Laden's earlier statements, his first major grievance is the American presence on the holy soil of Arabia, infidel soldiers on the heartland of Islam. The second grievance is using that place as a base from which to attack Iraq. Now, Iraq is not holy from a Muslim point of view, but for half a millennium it was the seat of the Caliphate, the greatest and most glorious period of Islamic history. And only in third place does he mention Jerusalem, not Palestine, just Jerusalem. I think that is an honest statement of his priorities, and a fairly general one. Since then, he has learned different tactics, and nowadays he gives more emphasis to Palestine, knowing that this will raise support for him in Europe and some other places.
You've written about something called the assassins.
A long time ago, yes.
If we know more about the assassins, what will that help us understand about what's going on here?
I don't think it will help very much, quite honestly. It was a different type of movement, a different inspiration. Excuse me.
Sure, and if you don't mind going back to between the 11th and the 13th century and just give us a little idea of who the assassins were and why it doesn't apply to today.
Well, in the first place, the assassins were, in a sense, a very marginal movement. They were from the Ismaili sect, which is a branch of the Shia sect, which means that from the point of view of the generality of Muslims, they were a heresy of a heresy, and not very far from what you might call mainstream Islam. The second difference is in their tactics. This was what I think is nowadays called targeted assassination. The assassin set out with a definite person in mind. The person was normally a ruler, a military commander, or a religious dignitary. These are the three, because they believed that the removal of this person would further their cause. Now, their cause was nothing less than taking over the Islamic world. And in this, I may say, there is a resemblance between them and the modern ones. The aim to get rid of what they regarded as the apostates and usurpers who were ruling Islam and establishing what they regarded as an authentic Islamic regime, which of course most Muslims would not accept as such. In that respect, there is a resemblance, because these people also have as their main target their own rulers. The fight against the West is in that sense incidental to their main aim, first to drive out the Westerners, which they regarded until a couple of weeks ago as comparatively easy. They may be changing their mind on that now, but the main task to overthrow their own rulers. Now, the main difference between the assassins then and the terrorists now is that there was no collateral damage. The assassin set out on a mission to kill a person. He killed that person and made no attempt to escape. The assassins made almost a sacrament of the assassination. They only used knives. There were other ways of killing people, even in the Middle Ages. They never used missiles of any sort. No bows and arrows, no crossbows, no catapults. They never used poison, and so on. This was a quite different approach to that of the modern terrorist, who is prepared to destroy thousands or tens of thousands of people entirely at random. This is a 20th century innovation.
By the way,
not part of Islam.
You've written about a dozen books, I understand.
More than that, actually.
How many? What's the total number?
About 20.
Of all those books, how many of them are still in print?
Most.
If somebody wants, in your opinion, to read about this, get the best background on it, what's the best book to read?
Oh, my next one, naturally. Still
But I just saw one in the bookstores, the history of the Middle East, 2,000 years.
As a general survey of my own books, I would recommend that one, yes. It does try to cover the history of the region from the rise of Christianity to the present day.
You say at the end of your National Review article, the last sentence is, we're either going to have to get tough or get out.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, the kind of wishy-washy policies that have been followed in the past just won't work. The question which people have been asking all the time is, I think, the wrong question. The question that people are asking is, why do they hate us? That's the wrong question. They've been hating us for a long time. In a sense, they've been hating us for centuries. And it's very natural that they should. You have this millennial rivalry between two world religions. And now, from their point of view, the wrong one seems to be winning. More generally, I mean, you can't be rich, strong, successful, and loved, particularly by those who are not rich, not strong, and not successful. So the hatred is something almost axiomatic. The question which we should be asking is, why do they neither fear nor respect us? And this is what comes out very clearly in the writings of Osama bin Laden. In the past, there were always rival powers. If they were unhappy with the Americans, they could turn to the Russians. If they were unhappy with the British, they could turn to the Germans. Can't do that anymore. But this has served not only to concentrate their minds wonderfully in one direction, but also to encourage them, because as they see it, they destroyed the Soviet Union. Through the long struggle in Afghanistan, and finally the Russians were driven out of Afghanistan by people like Osama bin Laden, as they see it, to such devastating effect that the Soviet Union itself collapsed. They saw this as stage one of the major victory. They regarded the Soviet Union as by far the more dangerous of the two superpowers. They were really scared of them. They were always much more careful in doing anything which might offend them, or even saying anything which might offend them. Having, as they see it, destroyed the Soviet Union, they reckoned that dealing with the United States would be comparatively easy. And this comes again and again in Osama bin Laden's writings and statements. He says, for example, the Americans are paper tigers. They've gone soft. Hit them and they'll run. And then the same litany is always repeated. Vietnam, Lebanon, Somalia. There is a belief which to any American would appear utterly preposterous, that what happened in Somalia was an attempt to establish an imperial American domination over that country, and this was foiled by the brave Somali people who stood up to defend their independence. I mean, this is obviously a gross travesty on both sides of what happened, but that is how Osama bin Laden sees it. And he saw this as evidence of weakness and softness, and was encouraged to go on with that. I think that during the last couple of weeks they may be changing their minds on that point.
Throughout all this, the George Bush name has been, in the last 10 to 12 years, been important. You have a former president who got us involved in Somalia in the first place. The same president was involved with the Carlyle group that was doing business with the bin Laden family over there. Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, was involved with Halliburton, who had a lot of contracts in that part of the world. How does somebody over there, when they look back at this government, do they see this? And does it matter in the whole thing?
I don't think it matters. I mean, these things do not accept major changes. I don't think so, anyway. But then I must point out, my specialization is the Middle East, not the Middle West, so these are matters on which I wouldn't claim any competence.
Well, the reason I ask whether or not, if they're mad, are they mad about the American people that in government making money off of this whole situation?
I don't think so. This doesn't come up very often in the literature.
Go back then to what you said, get tough or get out. How do we get tough? And if we get out, what happens? And what do you mean by get out?
Well, by get tough, I mean continue the good work that was started in Afghanistan and deal with some of the other countries or groups, terrorist groups in countries that help them. The alternative, get out, is find a substitute for oil so that the Middle East no longer matters and leave them to their own devices.
How long is that going to take?
That I have no idea. But these, it seems to me, are the two alternatives.
Do you get any sense of where this current town wants to go? Get tough or get out?
I think it's get tough rather than get out.
Do you like that?
I prefer it to getting out without good reason. Yes. I mean, to stay around and be bullied and insulted is not a good idea.
You also say that people's goodwill toward us is inverse to who the government supports.
Yes.
And we'll explain that.
Well, you can divide the whole Middle East basically into three regions. You have those countries which are ruled by governments that we regard as friends and allies. In those countries, the population is for the most part bitterly anti-American, notably Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And as they used to say in Moscow, it's no accident that the great majority of the hijackers come from those countries.
Why?
Because those populations are anti-American, and they are anti-American because they regard their governments as American puppets carrying out American purposes. Second group are the countries where the governments are anti-American, such as Iran and Iraq and Syria. In those countries, as far as we know, the people are very pro-American. There were remarkable demonstrations in Iran, for example, after September the 11th, when thousands of people went out into the streets to express, in a kind of vigil, to express their sympathy and their horror at what happened. This was nothing sponsored by the government. On the contrary, they tried to prevent it.
Can you explain this? Why?
Yes.
What is it?
If you have a very unpopular government and that unpopular government tells you that America is bad, you will automatically assume that America must be good. They see America as a possible hope of liberation. I'm told that recent events in Afghanistan have caused great excitement in Iran. I hope that the same thing might happen to them. I'm told that after seeing the scenes of rejoicing in Afghanistan being liberated from the Taliban, that would look like a funeral compared with what the Iranians and the Iraqis would do if they were liberated from their present rulers.
You mentioned more than once that you think freedom has a lot to do with this whole thing. And,
yes.
Explain that.
The desire for freedom is, I think, very natural. Now, constitutional democracy is a Western idea. Freedom as a political metaphor is a Western idea. But the Islamic world has its own system of political ideals and ideas. And for them, what matters, the criterion of good government is justice. And to a large extent, by justice, they mean many of the same things that we in the West mean by freedom. Government under law, government that is itself limited and responsible. And that is conspicuously lacking. People talk of the Middle East as a region of age-old autocracy, in a sense true. But the autocracies of the past were much more limited than those of the present day. May I just finish what I was saying before? The three regions, pro-American regimes, anti-American populations, anti-American regimes, pro-American populations, Iraq, Iran. The third group, where both the government and the people are friendly to the United States, and that's just two countries, the two which are democracies, where the governments are elected by the people and can be thrown out by the people, Turkey and Israel.
Is there any other country over there that you see moving in that direction?
Moving in the direction of democracy? Well, in a paradoxical way, I would say Iran is moving in that direction. They do have elections of a sort, it's true, under a whole series of constraints. Nevertheless, it has been possible in Iran for the electorate, the people in general, to express an opinion. It's indirect, it's ineffectual, but it's not unimportant because of that. And what you have in effect now in Iran is two governments, an elected government which has no power, and a real government which was never elected and is not answerable. And that sets up tensions which may well lead to the development of more democratic institutions. Among other countries, no, I don't see. The movement has been rather in the opposite direction.
As you've watched since September 11th, the whole discussion in this country, what grade would you give the, I'm sure that, well, let me ask it and you can answer any way you want. What grade would you give the media?
When you say the media, you're talking about an enormous number.
That's why I didn't want to ask it that way.
A great variety of newspapers and radio and television services. Very, very mixed, I would say. Very mixed, and on the whole, not very good.
Where would you go, or where do you go on a regular daily basis to get your information?
Shortwave radio.
What do you listen to?
Whatever I can get.
Why?
Because then I can get, first of all, direct news straight from the source, and hear the different points of view and the different versions of things. What bothers me about much that we get here is its triviality.
Like, can you give us an example of something that was trivial?
No, I'd rather not.
But when you listen to shortwave radio, can you understand the Arabic? And
yes.
When the Bin Laden tape came out, could you?
No, that was a very poor text. I don't think I would have been able to understand that, except for odd bits here and there. Not enough to follow the argument.
What do you hear, both in Arabic and Hebrew and the languages that you can speak and understand, that we can't if you don't speak those languages?
Day-to-day detail. And a lot of small things which are not even mentioned in the media. Can
you give an example of what you can pick up on shortwave radio? And can you listen to an Arabic station?
Oh, yes, there are a number of them. And also there are the European stations which broadcast to the Middle East, and they're often quite interesting too. I find NPR pretty useful, I must say.
In the book, one of the many we're talking about, but the most recent one, What Went Wrong, as we get near the end of this, what, in your opinion, did go wrong? What's the core thing that went wrong for the Islamic people?
I can't pick out just one thing and say that was the cause of it, because it's not only a question of what went wrong with them, it's a question of what went wrong with us. I mean, why did the West manage to advance while they fell back? So these are two questions, not one. And I think that there are many different causes. One of them, for example, is Atlantic shipping. Countries bordering the Atlantic Ocean, like England and Holland and France and Portugal, had to build bigger, stronger ships that could face the Atlantic. These could carry more guns and were therefore more effective in war, and they could carry cargoes greater distances more cheaply, more safely, and therefore more effective in peace. So that in both respects, they outdid the shipping of the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. which simply didn't need to be as big and as strong and as maneuverable. I think that's a very important element in the change which took place. When Atlantic fleets come into eastern waters, even a small country like Portugal or Holland can build a great empire in the east, defying all the mighty eastern empires. And I think, obviously, there are many elements in that, but Atlantic vessels is part of it. Another is the development of science. Now, that is really a restatement of the question rather than an answer to the question, because in the Middle Ages, they were in the forefront of science, and they continued to be for a little while after, but gradually they fell behind while the West advanced. Some people would say that the difference is the Reformation. Christendom went through a Reformation and a counter-Reformation. Islam has not done that yet, and some would argue that that is a factor. Personally, I think that one of the major factors is the difference in the treatment of women. And this was difference in treatment of women was often commented on by travelers both ways. Middle Eastern travelers to Europe talking with horror and disgust of the absurd freedom and deference accorded to women in this society. Visitors from the West to the Middle East talk with ill-concealed envy of the privileges of the Muslim male dealing with his womenfolk. But it isn't until a comparatively late stage that people suggest that this might have something to do with the civilizational difference. And for me, the first and strongest case is that put by a Turkish writer called Namık Kemal in an article published in 1868. I quote it in there, in which he says that the main reason, he says, for our backwardness, in 1868 the word backwardness was still permitted. He says the main reason for our backwardness as compared with the West is the way we treat our women, thereby depriving ourselves of the energies and talents of half the population. He uses a couple of striking metaphors. He says we treat women at best like jewels or musical instruments. And then he goes on to talk about the damage that this does to the society. And he ends by saying, our society, compared with the West, is like a human body that is paralyzed on one side. And Atatürk took up the same point in the early 20s when he founded and became first president of the Turkish Republic. We began with a campaign for women's rights. An unlikely advocate, an Ottoman Pasha and a general campaigning for women's rights, but he put his case very clearly and simply. He said, our task now is to catch up with the modern world. We will not catch up with the modern world if we only modernize half the population. I think he had a point. The Taliban might take note of that.
We've been talking about several things with Professor Bernard Lewis. One is the New Yorker from November 19th, 2001. Another article from National Review, December 17, 2001. And this book, a January book in your stores, What Went Wrong, Western Impact and Middle Eastern Response. Professor Bernard Lewis, Professor Emeritus at Princeton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.